The Burning Secret. Second part. In some way or other, therefore, he inferred, his father must be implicated in this great mystery and must have a secret power over them, because the very mention of him seemed to frighten and distress them. They said nothing this time either. They laid down their arms. The mother left the room with the Baron, and Edgar followed behind, not humbly like a servitor, but hard, strict, inexorable, like a guard over prisoners, rattling the chains against which they strained in vain. Hate had steeled his child's strength. He, the ignorant one, was stronger than the two older people whose hands were held fast by the great secret. Chapter 9. The Liars. Time was pressing. The Baron's holiday would soon come to an end, and the few days that remained must be exploited to the full. There was no use, both he and Edgar's mother felt, trying to break down the excited child's pertinacity. So they resorted to the extreme measure of disgraceful evasion and flight, merely to escape for an hour or two from under his yoke. "Please take these letters and have them registered at the post office," his mother said to Edgar in the hall, while the Baron was outside ordering a cab. Edgar, remembering that until then his mother had sent the hotel boys on her errands, was suspicious. Were they hatching something against him? He hesitated. "Where will you wait for me?" "Here, for sure." "Yes. Now be sure to. Don't leave before I come back." "Yeah, I'll wait right here in the hall, won't you?" In the consciousness of his superiority, he had adopted a commanding tone with his mother. Many things had changed since the day before yesterday. At the door he encountered the Baron, to whom he spoke for the first time in days. "I'm going to the post office to register these letters. My mother is waiting for me. Please do not go until I come back." The Baron hastened past him. "All right, well, wait." Edgar ran at top speed to the post office, where he had to wait while a man ahead of him asked a dozen silly questions. Finally, his turn came, and at last he was free to run back to the hotel, which he reached just in time to see the couple driving off. He turned rigid with anger, and had the impulse to pick up a stone and throw it at them. So they had escaped him after all, but by what a mean, contemptible lie. He had discovered the day before that his mother lied, but that she could so wantonly disregard a definite, expressed promise shattered his last remnant of confidence. He could not understand life at all any more, now that he realized that the words which he had thought clothed a reality were nothing more than bursting bubbles. But what a dreadful secret it must be that drove grown-up people to such lengths, to lie to him, a child, and to steal away like criminals. In the books he had read, man deceived and murdered one another for money, power, empire. But what was the motive here? What were his mother and the Baron after? Why did they hide from him? What were they, with their lies, trying to conceal? He racked his brain for answers to the riddle. Vaguely he divined that this secret was the bolt which, when unlocked, opened the door to let out childhood, and to master it meant to be grown up, to be a man at last. Oh, to know what it was. But he could no longer think clearly. His rage at their having escaped him was like a fire that sent scorching smoke into his eyes and kept him from seeing. He ran to the woods and in the nick of time reached a quiet, dark spot where no one could see him and burst into tears. Liars, dogs, mean. He felt he must scream the words out to relieve himself of his frenzy. All the pent-up rage, impatience, annoyance, curiosity, impotence, and the sense of betrayal of the last few days, which he had suppressed in the fond belief that he was an adult and must behave like an adult, now gushed from him in a fit of weeping and sobbing. It was the final crying spell of his childhood. For the last time he was giving into the bliss of weeping like a woman. In that moment of uncontrolled fury his tears washed away his whole childhood, trust, love, credulity, respect. The lad who returned to the hotel was different from the child that had left it. He was cool and level-headed. He went first to his room and washed his face carefully so that the two should not enjoy the triumph of seeing the traces of his tears. Then he planned his strategy and waited patiently, without the least agitation. There happened to be a good many guests in the hall when the carriage pulled up at the door. 2 gentlemen were playing chess, a few others were reading their papers, and a group of ladies sat together talking. Edgar sat among them quietly, a trifle pale, with wavering glances. When his mother and the Baron appeared in the doorway, rather embarrassed at encountering him so soon, and began to stammer out their excuses prepared in advance. He confronted them calmly and said to the Baron in a tone of challenge, "I have something to say to you, sir." "Very well, later, a little later." Edgar, pitching his voice louder and enunciating every word clearly and distinctly, said, so that everyone in the hall could hear, "No, now, you behaved like a villain. You knew my mother was waiting for me, and you, Edgar," cried his mother, feeling all glances upon her, and swooped down on him. But Edgar, realizing that she wanted to shout him down, screamed at the top of his voice, "I say again, in front of everybody, you lied disgracefully. It was a dirty trick." The Baron went white, the people stared, some laughed. The mother clutched the boy, who was quivering with excitement, and stammered out hoarsely, "Go right up to your room, or I'll give you a beating right here in front of everybody." But Edgar had already calmed down. He regretted he had been so violent and was discontented with himself that he had not coolly challenged the Baron as he had intended to do. But his anger had been stronger than his will. He turned and walked to the staircase leisurely, with an air of perfect composure. "You must excuse him," the mother still went on, stammering, confused by the rather wicked glances fixed upon her. "As a nervous child, you know." She was afraid of nothing so much as a scandal, and she knew she must assume innocence. Instead, therefore, of taking to instant flight, she went up to the desk and asked for her mail and made several other inquiries before rustling up the stairs as though nothing had happened. But behind her, she was quite conscious she had left a wake of whispered comment and suppressed giggling. On the first landing she hesitated, the rest of the steps she mounted more slowly. She was always unequal to a serious situation and was afraid of the inevitable explanation with Edgar. She was guilty, she could not deny that, and she dreaded the child's curious gaze, which paralyzed her and filled her with uncertainty. In her timidity she decided to try gentleness, because in a battle the excited child, she knew, was the stronger. She turned the knob gently. Edgar was sitting there quiet and cool, his eyes turned upon her at her entrance, not even betraying curiosity. He seemed to be very sure of himself. "Edgar," she began in the motherliest of tones, "what got into you? I was ashamed of you. How can one be so ill-bred, especially a child to a grown-up person? You must ask the Baron's pardon at once." "I will not." As he spoke, Edgar was looking out of the window, and his words might have been meant for the trees. His soreness was beginning to astonish his mother. "Edgar, what's the matter with you? You're so different from what you were. You used to be a good, sensible child with whom a person could reason, and all at once you act as though the devil had got into you. What have you got against the Baron? You liked him so much at first. He was so nice to you." "Yes, because he wanted to make your acquaintance." "Nonsense. How can you think anything like that?" The child flared up. "As a liar, as false through and through. Whatever he does is calculated and common. He wanted to get to know you, so he made friends with me and promised me a dog. I don't know what he promised you, or why he's so friendly with you, but he wants something of you, too, Mama. Positively he does. If he didn't, he wouldn't be so polite and friendly. Has a bad man. He lies. Just take a good look at him once, and see how false his eyes are. Oh, I hate him." "Edgar, how can you talk like that?" She was confused and did not know what to reply. The feeling stirred in her that the child was right. "Yes, has a bad man. You can't make me believe he isn't. You must see he is. Why is he afraid of me? Why does he try to keep out of my way? Because he knows I can see through him and his badness. How can you talk like that?" She kept protesting feebly. Her brain seemed to have dried up. All of a sudden a great fear came upon her, whether of the Baron or the boy, she knew not. Edgar saw that his warning was taking effect, and he was lured on to win her over to his side and have a comrade in his hate and hostility toward the Baron. He went over to her gently, put his arms about her, and said in a voice flattering with the excitement quivering in it, "Mama, you yourself must have noticed that it isn't anything good that he wants. Has made you quite different. You're the one that's changed, not I. He set you against me just to have you to himself. I'm sure he means to deceive you. I don't know what he promised you, but whatever it is, he doesn't intend to keep his promise. You ought to be careful of him. A man who will lie to one person will lie to another person too. Has a bad man. You mustn't trust him. Edgar's voice, soft and almost tearful, seemed to speak out of her own heart. Since the day before, an uncomfortable feeling had been rising in her which told her the same, with growing emphasis. But she was ashamed to tell her own child he was right, and she took refuge, as so many do when under the stress of overwhelming feeling, in rude rejoinder. She straightened herself up. Children don't understand such things. You have no right to mix into such matters. You must behave yourself. That's all. Edgar's face congealed again. Very well. I have warned you. Then you won't ask the Baron's pardon. No. They stood confronting each other, and the mother knew her authority was at stake. Then you will stay up here and eat by yourself, and you won't be allowed to come to table and sit with us until you have asked his pardon. It'll teach you manners. You won't budge from this room until I give you permission to. Do you hear? Edgar smiled. That cunning smile seemed to be part of his lips now. Inwardly he was angry at himself. How foolish to have let his heart run away with him again and to have tried to warn her. The liar. His mother rustled out without giving him another glance. That caustic gaze of his frightened her. The child had become an absolute annoyance to her since she realized that he had his eyes open and said the very things she did not want to know or hear. It was uncanny to have an inner voice, her conscience, dissevered from herself, incorporated in her child, going about as her child, warning her and making fun of her. Until then the child had stayed alongside of her life, as an ornament, a toy, a thing to love and have confidence in, now and then perhaps a burden, but always something that floated along in the same current as her own life, keeping even pace with it. For the first time, this something reared itself up and opposed her will. A feeling akin to hate mingled itself in her thoughts of her child now, and yet, as she was descending the stairs, a little tired, childish voice came from her own breast, saying, "You ought to be careful of him." On one of the landings was a mirror. The gleam of it struck her eyes, and she paused to scrutinize herself questioningly. She looked deeper and deeper into her own face until the lips of her image parted in a light smile and formed themselves as if to utter a dangerous word. The voice within her was still speaking, but she threw back her shoulders as though to shake off all those invisible thoughts, gave her reflection in the glass a bright glance, caught up her skirt, and descended the rest of the stairs with the determined manner of a player who has tossed his last coin down on the table. Chapter 10. On the trail, the waiter, after serving Edgar with dinner in his room, closed and locked the door behind him. The child started up in a rage. His mother's doings. She must have given orders for him to be locked in like a vicious beast. "What's going on downstairs?" he brooded grimly, "while I am locked in up here. What are they talking about, I wonder? Is the mystery taking place, and am I missing it? Oh, this secret that I sent all around me when I am with grown-ups. This thing that they shut me out from at night, and that makes them lower their voices when I come upon them unawares. This great secret that has been near me for days, close at hand, yet still out of reach. I've done everything to try to get at it." Edgar recalled the time when he had pilfered books from his father's library and had read them, and found they contained the mystery, though he could not understand it. There must be some sort of seal, he concluded, either in himself or in the others that had first to be removed before the mystery could be fathomed. He also recalled how he had begged the servant girl to explain the obscure passages in the books and she had only laughed at him. Dreadful, he thought, to be a child, full of curiosity, and yet not to be allowed even to ask for information, always to be ridiculed by the grown-ups, as if one were a stupid good-for-nothing. But never mind, I'm going to find it out, and very soon, I feel sure I will. Already part of it is in my hands, and I mean not to let go till I hold the whole of it. He listened to find out if anyone were coming to the room. Outside, the trees were rustling in a strong breeze, which caught up the silvery mirror of the moonlight and dashed it in shivering bits through the network of the branches. It can't be anything good that they intend to do, else they wouldn't have used such mean little lies to get me out of their way. Of course, they're laughing at me, the miserable creatures, because they're rid of me at last. But it'll be the one to laugh next. How stupid of me to allow myself to be locked in this room and give them a moment to themselves, instead of sticking to them like a burr and watching their every move. I know the grown-ups are always incautious and they will be giving themselves away. 2. Grown-ups think we're still babies and always go to sleep at night. They forget we can pretend to be asleep and can go on listening, and we can make out we're stupid when we're really very bright. Edgar smiled to himself sarcastically when at this point his thoughts reverted to the birth of a baby cousin. The family in his presence had pretended to be surprised, and he had known very well they were not surprised because for weeks he had heard them, at night when they thought he was asleep, discussing the coming event. And he resolved to fool his mother and the Baron in the same way. Oh, if only I could peep through the keyhole and watch them while they fancy they're alone and safe. Perhaps it would be a good idea to ring, and the boy would come and open the door and ask what I want. Or I could make a terrible noise smashing things, and then they'd unlock the door and it'd slip out. On second thought he decided against either plan, as incompatible with his pride. No one should see how contemptibly he had been treated, and he would wait till the next day. From beneath his window came a woman's laugh. Edgar started. Perhaps it was his mother laughing. She had good cause to laugh and make fun of the helpless little boy who was locked up when he was a nuisance and thrown into a corner like a bundle of rags. He leaned circumspectly out of the window and looked. No, it wasn't his mother, but one of a group of gay girls teasing a boy. In looking out, Edgar observed that his window was not very high above the ground, and instantly it occurred to him to jump down and go spy on his mother and the Baron. He was all fire with the joy of his resolve, feeling that now he had the great secret in his grasp. There was no danger in it. No people were passing by and with that he had jumped out. Nothing but the light crunch of the gravel under his feet to betray his action. In these 2 days, stealing around and spying had become the delight of his life, and intense bliss, mingled with a faint tremor of alarm, filled him now as he tiptoed around the outside of the hotel, carefully avoiding the lights. He looked first into the dining room. Their seats were empty. From window to window he went peeping, always outside the hotel for fear if he went inside he might run up against them in one of the corridors. Nowhere were they to be seen, and he was about to give up hope when he saw 2 shadows emerge from a side entrance. He shrank and drew back into the dark, and his mother and her inseparable escort came out. In the nick of time, he thought. What were they saying? He couldn't hear. They were talking in such low voices, and the wind was making such an uproar in the trees. His mother laughed. It was a laugh he had never before heard from her, a peculiarly sharp, nervous laugh, as though she had suddenly been tickled. It made a curious impression on the boy and rather startled him. But if she laughs, he thought, it can't be anything dangerous, nothing very big and mighty that they're concealing from me. He was a trifle disillusioned. Yet, why were they leaving the hotel? Where were they going alone together in the night? Every now and then great drifts of clouds obscured the moon, and the darkness was then so intense that one could scarcely see the white road at one's feet. But soon the moon would emerge again and robe the landscape in a sheet of silver. In one of the moments when the whole countryside was flooded in brilliance, Edgar saw the 2 silhouettes going down the road, or rather one silhouette. So close did they cling together, as if in terror. But where were they going? The fir trees groaned, the woods were all aster, uncannily, as though from a wild chase in their depths. I will follow them, thought Edgar. They cannot hear me in all this noise. Keeping to the edge of the woods, in the shadow, from which he could easily see them on the clear white road, he tracked them relentlessly, blasting the wind for making his footsteps inaudible and cursing it for carrying away the sound of their talk. It was not until he heard what they said that he could be sure of learning the secret. The Baron and his companion walked on without any misgivings. They felt all alone in the wide resounding night and lost themselves in their growing excitement, never dreaming that on the high edges of the road, in the leafy darkness, every movement of theirs was being watched, and a pair of eyes was clutching them in a wild grip of hate and curiosity. Suddenly they stood still, and Edgar, too, instantly stopped and pressed close up against a tree, in terror that they might turn back and reach the hotel before him, so that his mother would discover his room was empty and learn that she had been followed. Then he would have to give up hope of ever wresting the secret from them. But the couple hesitated. Evidently, there was a difference of opinion between them. Fortunately, at that moment the moon was shining and dimmed by clouds, and he could see everything clearly. The Baron pointed to a side path leading down into the valley, where the moonlight descended, not in a broad flood of brilliance, but only in patches filtering here and there through the heavy foliage. Why does he want to go down there? Thought Edgar. His mother, apparently, refused to take the path, and the Baron was trying to persuade her. Edgar could tell from his gestures that he was talking emphatically. The child was alarmed. What did this man want of his mother? Why did he attempt, villain, to drag her into the dark? From his books, to him the world, came live memories of murder and seduction and sinister crime. There, he had it. The Baron meant to murder her. That was why he had kept him, Edgar, at a distance, and enticed her to this lonely spot. Should he cry for help? Murder. He wanted to shriek, but his throat and lips were dry and no sound issued from his mouth. His nerves were tense as a bowstring. He could scarcely stand upright on his shaking knees, and he put out his hand for support, when, crack, crack, a twig snapped in his grasp. At the sound of the breaking twig, the two turned about in alarm and stared into the darkness. Edgar clung to the tree, his little body completely wrapped in obscurity, quiet as death. Yet they seemed to have been frightened. "Let's go home," he could now hear his mother say anxiously, and the Baron, who, evidently, was also upset, assented. Pressed close against each other, they walked back very slowly. Their embarrassment was Ajar's good fortune. He got down on all fours and crouched, tearing his hands and clothes on the brambles, through the undergrowth to the turn of the woods, from where he ran breathlessly back to the hotel and up the stairs to his room. Luckily, the key was sticking on the outside, and in 1 second he was in his room lying on the bed, where he had to rest a few moments to give his pounding heart a chance to quiet down. After 2 or 3 minutes, he got up and looked out of the window to await their return. They must have been walking very slowly indeed. It took them an eternity. Circumspectly he peeped out of the shadowed frame. There, at length, they came at a snail's pace, the moonlight shining on their clothes. They looked like ghosts in the greenish shimmer, and the delicious horror came upon him again whether it really might have been a murder, and what a dreadful catastrophe he had averted by his presence. He could clearly see their faces, which looked chalky in the white light. His mother had an expression of rapture that in her was strange to him, while the Baron looked hard and dejected, probably because he had failed in carrying out his purpose. They were very close to the hotel now, but it was not until they reached the steps that their figures separated from each other. Would they look up? Edgar waited eagerly. No, they have forgotten all about me, he thought wrathfully, and then, in triumph, but I haven't forgotten you. You think I am asleep or non-existent, but you'll find out you're mistaken. I'll watch every step you take until I have got the secret out of you, you villain, the dreadful secret that keeps me awake nights. I'll tear the strings that tie you two together. I am not going to go to sleep. As the couple entered the doorway, the shadows mingled again in one broad band that soon dwindled and disappeared, and once more the space in front of the hotel lay serene in the moonlight, like a meadow of snow. Chapter 11. The Surprise Attack. Edgar moved away from the window, breathing heavily, in a shiver of horror. A gruesome mystery of this sort had never touched his life before, the bookish world of thrilling adventure, excitement, deception, and murder having always belonged to the same realm as the wonderland of fairy tales, the realm of dreams, far away, in the unreal and unattainable. Now he was plunged right into the midst of this fascinatingly awful world, and his whole being quivered deliriously. Who was this mysterious being who had stepped into his quiet life? Was he really a murderer? If not, why did he always try to drag his mother to a remote, dark spot? Something dreadful, Edgar felt certain, was about to happen. He did not know what to do. In the morning he would surely write or telegraph his father. Why not that very moment? His mother was not in her room yet, but was still with that horrid person. The outside of the door to Ajar's room was hung with a portiere, and he opened his door softly now, closed it behind him, and stuck himself between the door and the portiere, listening for his mother's steps in the corridor, determined not to let her stay by herself a single instant. The corridor, at this midnight hour, was quiet and empty and lighted faintly by a single gas jet. The minutes stretched themselves into hours, it seemed, before he heard cautious footsteps coming up the stairs. He strained his ears to listen. The steps did not move forward with the quick, regular beat of someone making straight for his room, but sounded hesitating and dragging as though up a steep, difficult climb. Edgar also caught the sound of whispering, a pause, then whispering again. He was aquiver with excitement. Was it both of them coming up together? Was the creature still sticking to her? The whispering was too low and far away for him to catch what they were saying, but the footsteps, though slowly and with pauses between, were drawing nearer. And now he could hear the Baron's voice how he hated the sound of it, saying something in a low, hoarse tone, which he could not get, and then his mother answering as though towards something off, no, not tonight. Edgar's excitement rose to fever heat. As they came nearer, he would be bound to catch everything they said. Each inch closer that they drew was like a physical hurt in his breast, and the Baron's voice, how ugly it seemed, that greedy, grasping, disgusting voice. Don't be cruel. You were so lovely this evening. No, I mustn't. I can't. Let me go. There was such alarm in his mother's voice that the child was terrified. What did the Baron want her to do? Why was she afraid? They were quite close up to him now, apparently right in front of the portiere. A foot or two away from them was he, trembling, invisible, with a bit of drapery for his only protection. Edgar heard his mother give a faint groan as though her powers of resistance were weakening. But what was that? Edgar could hear that they had passed his mother's door and had kept on walking down the corridor. Where was he dragging her off to? Why was she not replying any more? Had he stuffed his handkerchief into her mouth and was he squeezing her throat? Wild with this thought, Edgar pushed the portiere aside and peeped out at the two figures in the dim corridor. The Baron had his arm round the woman's waist and was forcing her along gently, evidently with little resistance from her. He stopped at his own door. He wants to drag her in and commit the foul deed, though the child, and dashing the portiere aside he rushed down the hall upon them. His mother screamed, something came leaping at her out of the dark, and she seemed to fall in a faint. The Baron held her up with difficulty. The next instant he felt a little fist dealing him a blow that smashed his lips against his teeth, and a little body clawing at him cat-like. He released the terrified woman, who quickly made her escape, and, without knowing against whom, he struck out blindly. The child knew he was the weaker of the two, yet he never yielded. At last the great moment had come when he could unburden himself of all his betrayed love and accumulated hate. With set lips and a look of frenzy on his face, he pounded away at the Baron with his two small fists. By this time the Baron had recognized his assailant. He, too, was primed with hate of the little spy who had been dogging him and interfering with his sport, and he hit back, striking out blindly. Edgar groaned once or twice, but did not let go, and did not cry for help. They wrestled a fraction of a minute in the dark corridor grimly and sullenly without the exchange of a single word. But pretty soon the Baron came to his senses, and realizing how absurd was this duel with the half-grown boy, he caught hold of Edgar to throw him off. But Edgar, feeling his muscles weakening and conscious that the next moment he would be beaten, snapped, in a fury, at the strong, firm hand gripping at the nape of his neck. The Baron could not restrain a slight outcry, and let go of Edgar, who seized the opportunity to run to his room and draw the bolt. The midnight struggle had lasted no more than a minute. No one in any of the rooms along the corridor had caught a sound of it. Everything was silent, wrapped in sleep. The Baron wiped his bleeding hand with his handkerchief and peered into the dark uneasily to make sure no one had been watching or listening. All he saw was the one gas jet winking at him. He thought, sarcastically. Chapter 12. The Tempest. Edgar woke up the next morning dazed, wondering whether it had not been a horrid dream, and with the sickly feeling that hangs on after a nightmare, his head leaden and his body like a piece of wood. It was only after a minute or so that he realized with a sort of alarm that he was still in his day clothes. He jumped out of bed and went to look at himself in the mirror. The image of his own pale, distorted face, with his hair all rumpled and a red, elongated swelling on his forehead, made him recoil with a shudder. It brought back to him the actuality painfully. He recalled the details of the battle in the corridor, and his rushing back to his room and throwing himself onto the bed dressed. He must have fallen asleep thus and dreamed everything over again, only worse and mingled with the warmish smell of fresh flowing blood. Footsteps crunched on the gravel beneath his window, voices rose like invisible birds, and the sun shone deep into the room. It must be very late, he thought, glancing at his watch, but the hands pointed to midnight. In the excitement of the day before, he had forgotten to wind it up. This uncertainty, this hanging suspended in time, disturbed him, and his sense of disgust was increased by his confusion of mind as to what had actually occurred. He dressed quickly and went downstairs, a vague sense of guilt in his heart. In the breakfast room, his mother was sitting at their usual table, alone. Thank goodness, his enemy was not present. Edgar would not have to look upon that hateful face of his. And yet, as he went to the table, he was by no means sure of himself. "Good morning," he said. His mother made no reply, nor even so much as glanced up, but kept her eyes fixed in a peculiarly rigid stare on the view from the window. She looked very pale, her eyes were red-rimmed, and there was that quivering of her nostrils which told so plainly how wrought up she was. Edgar bit his lips. Her silence bewildered him. He really did not know whether he had hurt the Baron very much or whether his mother had any knowledge at all of their encounter. The uncertainty plagued him, but her face remained so rigid that he did not even attempt to look up for fear that her eyes, now hidden behind lowered lids, might suddenly raise their curtains and pop out at him. He sat very still, not daring to make the faintest sound, and raising the cup to his lips and putting it back on the saucer with the utmost caution, and casting furtive glances, from time to time, at his mother's fingers, which played with her spoon nervously and seemed, in the way they were bent, to show a secret anger. For a full quarter of an hour he sat at the table in an oppressive expectancy of something that never came, not a single word from her to relieve his tension. And now, as his mother rose, still without any sign of having noticed his presence, he did not know what to do, whether to remain sitting at the table or to go with her. He decided upon the latter, and followed humbly, though conscious how ridiculous was his shadowing of her now. He reduced his steps so as to fall behind, and she, still studiously refraining from noticing him, went to her room. When Edgar reached her door, he found it locked. What had happened? He was at his wit's end. His assurance of the day before had deserted him. Had he done wrong, after all, in attacking the Baron? And were they preparing a punishment for him or a fresh humiliation? Something must happen, he was positive, something dreadful, very soon. Upon him and his mother lay the sultriness of a brewing tempest. They were like two electrified poles that would have to discharge themselves in a flash. And for solitary hours the child dragged round with him, from room to room, the burden of this premonition, until his thin little neck bent under the invisible yoke, and by midday was a very humble little fellow that took his seat at table. "How do you do?" he ventured again, feeling he had to rend this silence, ominous as a great black storm cloud. But still his mother made no response, keeping her gaze fixed beyond him. Edgar, in renewed alarm, felt he was in the presence of a calculated, concentrated anger such as he had never before encountered. Until then his mother's scoldings had been outbursts of nervousness rather than of ill feeling, and soon melted into a mollifying smile. This time, however, he had, as he sensed, brought to the surface a wild emotion from the deeps of her being, and this powerful something that he had evoked terrified him. He scarcely dared to eat. His throat was parched and knotted into a lump. His mother seemed not to notice what was passing in her son, but when she got up she turned, with a casual air, and said, "Come up to my room afterwards. Edgar, I have something to say to you." Her tone was not threatening, but so icy that Edgar felt as though each word were like a link in an iron chain being laid round his neck. His defiance had been crushed out of him. Silently, with a hangdog air, he followed her up to her room. In the room she prolonged his agony by saying nothing for several minutes, during which he heard the striking of the clock, and outside a child laughing, and within his own breast his heart beating like a trip hammer. Yet she, too, could not be feeling so very confident of herself either, because she kept her eyes averted and even turned her back while speaking to him. "I shall say nothing to you about the way you behaved yesterday. It was unpardonable, and it makes me feel ashamed to think of it. You have to suffer the consequences now of your own conduct. All I mean to say to you is that this is the last time you will be allowed to associate with your elders. I have just written to your father that either you must be put under a tutor or sent to a boarding school where you will be taught manners. I shan't be bothered with you anymore." Edgar stood with bowed head, feeling that this was only the preliminary, a threat of the real thing coming, and he waited uneasily for the sequel. "You will ask the Baron's pardon." Edgar gave a start, but his mother would not be interrupted. "The Baron laughed today, and you will write him a letter which I shall dictate." Edgar again made a movement, which his mother firmly disregarded. "No protestations. Here is the paper, and here are the pen and the ink. Sit down." Edgar looked up. Her eyes were steely with an inflexible determination. This hardness and composure in his mother were quite new and strange. He was frightened and seated himself at the desk, keeping his face bent low. The date upper right-hand corner. "Have you written it? Space. Dear Sir, colon. Next line. I have just learned to my regret that. To my regret that you have already left Summering. To Ms. in Summering. And so I must do by letter what I had intended to do in person. That is faster. Edgar, you don't have to draw each letter beg your pardon for what I did yesterday. As my mother told you, I'm just convalescing from a severe illness and am very excitable. On account of my condition, I often exaggerate things and the next moment I am sorry for it." The back bent over the desk straightened up. Edgar turned in a flash. His defiance had leapt into life again. "I will not write that. It isn't true. Edgar, it is not true. I haven't done anything that I should be sorry for. I haven't done anything bad that I need ask anybody's pardon for. I simply came to your rescue when you called for help." Every drop of blood left her lips. Her nostrils widened. "I called for help. You're crazy." Edgar got angry and jumped up from his chair. "Yes, you did call for help in the corridor when he caught hold of you. You said, 'Let me go, so loud that I heard it in my room.' You lie. I never was in the corridor with the Baron. He went with me only as far as the foot of the stairs." Ajar's heart stood still at the barefacedness of the lie. He stared at her with glassy eyeballs and cried in a voice thick and husky with passion, "Yow a note in the hall." "And he did not have his arm round you." She laughed a cold, dry laugh. "You were dreaming." That was too much. The child, by this time, knew that adults lie and resort to impudent little evasions, lies that slip through fine sieves and cunning ambiguities. But this downright denial of an absolute fact, face to face, threw him into a frenzy. "Dreaming, was I? Did I dream this bump on my forehead, too? How do I know whom you've been rowdying with? But I am not going to argue with you. You are to obey orders. That's all. Sit down and finish the letter." She was very pale and was summoning all her strength to keep on her feet. In Edgar, a last tiny flame of credulity went out. To tread on the truth and extinguish it as one would a burning match was more than he could stomach. His insides congealed in an icy lump, and everything he now said was in a tone of unrestrained, pointed maliciousness. "So I dreamed what I saw in the hall, did I? I dreamed this bump on my forehead, and that you two went walking in the moonlight and he wanted to make you go down the dark path into the valley. I dreamed all that, did I? What do you think, that I'm going to let myself be locked up like a baby? No, I am not so stupid as you think. I know what I know." He stared into her face impudently. To see her child's face close to her own distorted by hate broke her down completely. Her passion flooded over in a tidal wave. "Sit down and write that letter. Or what?" he sneered. "Or I'll give you a whipping like a little child." Edgar drew close to her and merely laughed sardonically. With that her hand was out and had struck his face. Edgar gave a little outcry, and, like a drowning man, with a dull rushing in his ears and flickerings in his eyes, he struck out blindly with both fists. He felt he encountered something soft, a face, heard a cry. The cry brought him to his senses. Suddenly he saw himself and his monstrous ecthi had struck his own mother. A dreadful terror came upon him. Shame and horror, an impetuous need to get away seized him, to sink into the earth. He wanted to fly far away from those eyes that were upon him. He made for the door and in an instant was gone, down the stairs, through the lobby, out on the road. Away, away, as though a pack of ravening beasts were at his heels. Chapter 13. Dawning perception. After he had put a long stretch of road between him and the hotel, Edgar stopped running. He was panting heavily, and he had to lean against a tree to get his breath back and recover from the trembling of his knees. The horror of his own deed, from which he had been fleeing, clutched at his throat and shook him as with a fever. What should he do now? Where should he run away to? He was already feeling a sinking sensation of loneliness there in the woods, only a mile or so from the house. Everything seemed different and friendlier and kinder now that he was alone and helpless. The trees that only the day before had whispered to him like brothers now gathered together darkly as if in threat. This solitariness in the great unknown world dazed the child. No, he could not stand alone yet. But to whom should he go? Of his father, who was easily excited and unapproachable. He was afraid. Besides, his father would send him straight back to his mother, and Edgar preferred the awfulness of the unknown to that. He felt as though he could never look upon his mother's face again without remembering that he had struck her with his fist. His grandmother in Baines occurred to him. She was so sweet and kind and had always patted him and come to his rescue when, at home, he was to be the victim of an injustice. He would stay with her until the first storm of wrath had blown over, and then he would write to his parents to ask their forgiveness. In this brief quarter of an hour he had already been so humbled by the mere thought of his inexperienced self standing alone in the world that he cursed the stupid pride that a mere stranger's lying had put into him. He no longer wanted to be anything but the child he had been, obedient and patient and without the arrogance that he now felt to be excessive. But how to reach Baines? He took out his little pocketbook and blasted his luck star that the $10 gold piece given to him on his birthday was there safe and sound. He had never got himself to break it. Daily he had inspected his purse to see if it was there and to feast his eyes on the sight of it and gratefully polish it with his handkerchief until it shone like a tiny sun. But would the $10 be enough? He had travelled by train many a time without thinking that one had to pay, and still less how much one paid, whether $10 or $100. For the first time, he got an inkling that there were facts in life upon which he had never reflected, and that all the many things that surrounded him and he had held in his hands and toyed with somehow contained value of their own, a special importance. An hour before he had thought he knew everything. Now he realized he had passed by 1,000 mysteries and problems without noticing them, and was ashamed that his poor little wisdom had stumbled over the first step it took into life. He grew more and more discouraged, and his footsteps lagged as he drew near the station. How often he had dreamed of this flight from home, of making a dash for the great life, becoming king or emperor, soldier or poet. And now he looked timidly at the bright little building ahead of him and thought of nothing but whether his $10 would bring him to his grandmother at Baines. The rails stretched away monotonously into the country. The station was deserted. Edgar went to the window shyly and asked, whispering so that nobody but the ticket seller should hear, how much a ticket to Baines cost. Amused and rather astonished eyes behind spectacles smiled upon the timid child. "Whole fare or half fare?" "Whole fare," stammered Edgar, utterly without pride. $3.35. "Give me a ticket, please." In great relief, Edgar shoved the beloved bit of polished gold under the grating. Change rattled on the ledge, and Edgar all at once felt immensely wealthy, holding the strip of colored paper that guaranteed him his liberty, and with the sound of coin clinking in his pocket. On examining the timetable, he found there would be a train in only 20 minutes, and he retired to a corner to get away from the few people idling on the platform. Though it was evident they were harboring no suspicions, the child, as if his flight and his crime were branded on his forehead, felt that they were looking at nothing but him and were wondering why a mere boy such as he should be traveling alone. He drew a great sigh of relief when at last the first whistle sounded in the distance, and the rumbling came closer and closer, and the train that was to carry him out into the great world puffed and snorted into the station. It was not until Edgar took his seat in the train that he noticed he had secured only a third-class passage. Having always travelled first class, he was again struck with a sense of difference. He saw there were distinctions that had escaped him. His fellow passengers were unlike those of his first-class trips, a few Italian labourers, with tough hands and uncouth voices, carrying pickaxes and shovels. They sat directly opposite, dull and disconsolate-eyed, staring into space. They must have been working very hard on the road, for some of them slept in the rattling coach, open-mouthed, leaning against the hard, soiled wood. They have been working to earn money, came into Ajar's mind, and he set to guessing how much they earned, but could not decide. And so another disturbing fact impressed itself upon him, that money was something one did not always have on hand, but had to be made somehow or other. And for the first time he became conscious of having taken the ease in which he had been leapt as a matter of course, and that to the right and the left of him abysms yond which his eyes had never beheld. It came to him now with a shock of suddenness that there were trades and professions, that his life was hedged about by innumerable secrets, close at hand and tangible, though he had never noticed them. Edgar was learning a good deal in that single hour of aloneness, and saw many things as he looked out of his narrow compartment into the great wide world. And for all his dark dread, something began to unfold itself gently within him, not exactly happiness as yet, rather a marveling at the diversity of life. He had fled, he felt, out of fear and cowardice, yet it was his first independent act, and he had experienced something of the reality that he had passed by, until then, without heeding it. Perhaps he himself was now as much of a mystery to his mother and his father as the world had been to him. It was with different eyes that he looked out of the window. He was now viewing actualities, it seemed to him. A veil had been lifted from all things, and they were showing him the core of their purpose, the secret spring of their actions. Houses flew by as though torn away by the wind, and he pictured to himself the people living in them. Were they rich or poor, happy or unhappy? Were they filled with the same longing as he to know everything? And were there children in those houses like himself who had merely been playing with things? The flagman who waved the train no longer seemed like scattered dolls, inanimate objects, toys stationed there by indifferent chance. Edgar now understood that the giving of the signal was their fate, their struggle with life. The wheels turned faster and faster. Along serpentine windings the train made its way downward from the uplands. The mountains took on gentler curves and receded into the distance. The level was reached, and Edgar gave one final glance backward. There were the mountains like blue shadows, remote and inaccessible. And to Edgar it was as though his childhood were reposing up there where they lightly merged with the misty heavens. Chapter 14. Darkness and Confusion. When the train pulled into the station at Baines, the street lamps were already lit, and though the station was bright with its red and white and green signals, Edgar unexpectedly felt a dread of the approaching night. In the daytime he would still have been confident. People would have been thronging the streets, and you could sit down on a bench and rest, or look into the shop windows. But how would he be able to stand it when the people had all withdrawn into their homes and gone to bed for a night's peaceful sleep, while he, conscious of wrongdoing, wandered about alone in a strange city, just to have a roof over his head, not to spend another moment under the open heavens? That was his one distinct feeling. He hurried along the familiar way without looking to right or left until he reached his grandmother's villa. It was on a beautiful, broad avenue, placed, not free to the gaze of passers-by, but behind the vines and shrubbery and ivy of a well-kept garden, a gleam behind a cloud of green, a white, old-fashioned, friendly house. Edgar peeped through the iron grille like a stranger. No sound came from within, and the windows were closed. Evidently the family and guests were in the garden behind the house. Edgar was about to pull the doorbell when something odd occurred. Suddenly, the thing that only a few hours before had seemed quite natural to him had now become impossible. How was he to go into the house? How meet his grandmother and her family? How endure all the questions they would besiege him with, and how answer them? How would he be able to bear the looks they would give him when he would tell, as he would be obliged to, that he had run away from his mother? And, above all, how would he explain his monstrous deed, which he himself no longer understood? A door in the house slammed, and Edgar, in a sudden panic at being detected, ran off. When he reached the park he paused. It was dark there, and he expected to find it empty and thought it would be a good place to sit down in and rest and at last reflect quietly and come to some understanding with himself about his fate. He passed through the gateway timidly. A few lamps were burning near the entrance. giving the young leaves on the trees a ghostly gleam of transparent green. But deeper in the park, down the hill, everything lay like a single, black, fermenting mass in the darkness. Edgar, eager to be alone, slipped past the few people who were sitting in the light of the lamps, talking or reading. But even in the deep shadows of the unilluminated pathways it was not quiet. There were low whisperings that seemed to shun the light, sounds mingled with the rustling of the leaves, the scraping of feet, subdued voices, all mingled with a certain voluptuous, sighing, groaning sound that seemed to emanate from people and animals and nature, all in a disturbed sleep. It was a restlessness that had something foreboding in it, something sneaking, hidden, puzzling, a sort of subterranean stirring in the wood that was connected perhaps with nothing but the spring, yet had a peculiarly alarming effect upon the child. He cowered into a diminutive heap on a bench and tried to think of what he was to say at home, but his thoughts slipped away from him as on a slippery surface before he could grasp his own ideas, and in spite of himself he had to keep listening and listening to the muffled tones, the mystical voices of the darkness. How terrible the darkness was, how bewildering and yet how mysteriously beautiful. Were they animals, or people, or was it merely the ghostly hand of the wind that wove together all this rustling and crackling and whirring? He listened. It was the wind gently moving the tree tops. No, it wasn't. It was people. No, he could see distinctly couples arm in arm, who came up from the lighted city to enliven the darkness with their perplexing presence. What were they after? He could not make out. They were not talking to each other, because he heard no voices. All he could catch was the sound of their tread on the gravel, and here and there the sight of their figures moving like shadows past some clear space between the trees, always with their arms round each other, like his mother and the Baron in the moonlight. So the great, dazzling, portentous secret was here, too. Steps approached. A subdued laugh. Edgar, for fear of being discovered, drew deeper into the dark, but the couple now groping their way in the deep gloom had no eyes for him. They passed him by, closely locked, and they stopped only a few feet beyond his bench. They pressed their faces together. Edgar could not see clearly, but he heard a soft groan from the woman, and the man stammering mad, ardent words. A sort of sultry presentiment touched Ajar's alarm with a shudder that was sensual and pleasant. The couple stayed thus a minute or so, and then the gravel crunched under their tread again, and the sound of their footsteps died away in the darkness. A tremor went through Edgar. His blood whirled hot through his veins, and all of a sudden he felt unbearably alone in this bewildering darkness, and the need came upon him with elemental force for the sound of a friend's voice, an embrace, a bright room, people he loved. The whole perplexing darkness this night seemed to be inside his breast, rending it. He jumped up. To be at home, just to be at home, anywhere at home in a warm, bright room, in some relation with people. What could happen to him then? Even if they were to scold and beat him, he would not mind all that darkness and the dread of loneliness. Unconsciously he made his way back to grandmother's villa and found himself standing with the cool doorbell in his hand again. Now, he observed, the lighted windows were shining through the foliage, and he pictured each room belonging to each window and the people inside. This very proximity to familiar beings, the comforting sense of being near people who, he knew, loved him was delightful, and if he hesitated it was simply to taste this joy a little longer. Suddenly a terrified voice behind him shrieked, "Edgar, why, here he is." It was his grandmother's maid. She pounced on him and grabbed his hand. The door was pulled open from within. A dog jumped at Edgar, barking. People came running, and voices of mingled alarm and joy called out. The first to meet Edgar was his grandmother with outstretched arms, and behind her he thought he must be dreaming his mother. Tears came to Ajar's eyes, and he stood amid this ardent outburst of emotions, quivering and intimidated, undecided what to say or do and very uncertain of his own feelings. He was not sure whether he was glad or frightened. Chapter 15. The Last Dream. They had been looking for him in Baines for some time. His mother, in spite of her anger, had been alarmed when he did not return and had had search made for him all over summering. The whole place was aroused, and people were making every sort of dreadful conjecture when a man brought the news that he had seen the child at the ticket office. Inquiry at the railroad station, of course, brought out that Edgar had bought a ticket to Baines, and his mother, without hesitation, took the very next train after him, telegraphing first to his father and to his grandmother. The family held on to Edgar, but not forcibly. On the contrary, they led him with an air of suppressed triumph into the front room. And how odd it was that he did not mind their reproaches, because he saw happiness and love in their eyes. And even their assumed anger lasted only a second or two. His grandmother was embracing him again tearfully. No one spoke of his bad conduct, and he felt the wondrousness of the protection surrounding him. The maid took off his coat and brought him a warmer one, and his grandmother asked if he did not want something to eat. They pestered him with their inquiries and their tenderness, but stopped questioning him when they noticed how embarrassed he was. He experienced deliciously the sensation that he had so despised before of being wholly a child, and he was ashamed of his arrogance of the last few days when he had wanted to dispense with it all and exchange it for the deceptive joy of solitariness. The telephone rang in the next room. He heard his mother's voice in snatches. Audiobook got Harrel's train, and he marvelled that she had not flown at him in a passion. She had put her arms round him, with a peculiarly constrained expression in her eyes. He began to regret his conduct more and more, and he would have liked to extricate himself from his grandmother's and aunt's tenderness, to run to his mother and beg her pardon and tell her, by herself, oh, so humbly, that he wanted to be a child again and obey her. But when he rose, with a perfectly gentle movement, his grandmother asked in alarm where he was going. He felt ashamed. If he made a single step, it frightened them. He had frightened them all terribly, and they were afraid he was going to run away again. How could he make them understand that nobody regretted his flight more than he did? The table was set. Supper had been prepared for him hurriedly. His grandmother sat beside him without removing her eyes from him. She and his aunt and the maid held him fast in a quiet circle, the warmth of which calmed him wonderfully, and the only disturbing thought was that of his mother's absence from the room. If only she could have guessed how humble he was, she would certainly have come in. From outside came the sound of a cab drawing up at the door. Everyone gave a start, so that Edgar also was upset. His grandmother went out. He could hear loud voices in the hall, and then it struck him it must be his father who had arrived. He observed timidly that he had been left alone in the room. To be alone even for those few moments made him nervous. His father was a stern man. He was the one person Edgar really feared. He listened. His father seemed to be excited. His voice was loud and expressed annoyance. Every now and then came his grandmother's and his mother's voices in mollifying tones, in attempts, evidently, to make him adopt a milder attitude. But his father's voice remained hard as his foot treads now coming nearer and nearer, and now stopping short at the door, which was next pulled violently open. The boy's father was a large man, and Edgar felt so very, very thin beside him as he entered the room, nervous and genuinely angry, it seemed. What got into your head to run away? How could you give your mother such a fright? His voice was wrathful and his hands made a wild movement. Edgar's mother came in and stood behind her husband, her face in shadow. Edgar made no reply. He felt he had to justify himself, but how tell the story of the way they had lied to him and how his mother had slapped him? Would his father understand? Well, where's your tongue? What was the matter? You may tell me. You needn't be afraid. You must have had some good reason for running away. Did anyone do anything to you? Edgar hesitated. At the recollection of the events in Summering, his anger began to flare up again, and he was about to bring his charge against his mother when he saw his heart stood still that she was making an odd gesture behind his father's back. At first he did not comprehend, but he kept his eyes fixed on her and noticed that the expression of her face was beseeching. Then very softly she lifted her finger to her mouth in sign that he should keep everything to himself. The child was conscious of a great wild joy pouring in a warm wave over his whole body. He knew she was giving him the secret to guard and that a human destiny was hanging in the balance on his child's lips. Filled with a jubilant pride that she reposed confidence in him, he suddenly became possessed by a desire for self-sacrifice. He magnified his own wrongdoing in order to show how much of a man he had grown to be. Collecting his wits, he said, No. There was no good reason for my running away. Mama was very kind to me, but I didn't behave myself, and I was ashamed, and so I ran away. The father looked at his son in amazement. Such a confession was the last thing he expected to hear. His wrath was disarmed. "Well, if you're sorry, then it's all right, and we won't say any more about it today. You'll be careful in the future, though, not to do anything of the sort again." He paused and looked at Edgar, and his voice was milder as he went on. "How pale you are, boy. But I believe you've grown taller in this short while. I hope you won't be guilty of such childish behavior again, because really you're not a child anymore, and you ought to be sensible." Edgar, the whole time, had kept looking at his mother. Something peculiar seemed to be glowing in her eyes, or was it the reflection of the light? No, it was something new. Her eyes were moist, and there was a smile on her lips that said thank you to him. They sent him to bed, but he was not now distressed at being left alone. He had such a wealth of things to think over. All the agony of the past days was dissipated by the tremendous sense of his first experience of life. He felt happy in a mysterious presentiment of future experiences. Outside, the trees were rustling in the gloomy night, but he was not scared. He had lost all impatience at having to wait for life now that he knew how rich it was. For the first time, that day, it seemed to him, he had seen life naked, no longer veiled behind the thousand lies of childhood. He saw it in its complete, fearful, voluptuous beauty. Never had he supposed that days could be crowded so full of transitions from sorrow to joy and back again, and it made him happy to think there were many more such days in store for him, and that a whole life was waiting to reveal its mystery to him. A first inkling had come to him of the diversity of life. For the first time, he thought, he understood man's beings, that they heeded each other even when they seemed to be inimical, and that it was very sweet to be loved by them. He was incapable of thinking of anything or anybody with hate. He regretted nothing and had a sense of gratitude even to the Baron, his bitterest enemy, because it was he who had opened the door for him to this world of dawning emotions. It was very sweet to be lying in the dark thinking thoughts that were mingled vaguely with dreams and were lapsing almost into sleep. Was it a dream, or did Edgar really hear the door open and someone creep softly into his room? He was too sleepy to open his eyes and look. Then he felt a breath upon his face and the touch of another face, soft and warm and gentle, against his, and he knew it was his mother who was kissing him and stroking his hair. He felt her kisses and her tears, and responded to her caresses. He took them as reconciliation and gratitude for his silence. It was not until many years later that he really understood these silent tears and knew they were a vow of this woman verging on middle age to dedicate herself henceforth to her child and renounce adventure and all desire on her own behalf. They were a farewell. He did not know that she was thanking him for more than his silence. She was grateful that he had rescued her from a barren experience, and in these caresses was bequeathing him the bittersweet legacy of her love for his future life. Nothing of all this did the child lying there comprehend, but he felt it was blissful to be so loved, and that by this love he was already entangled in the great secret of the world. When she had withdrawn her hand from his head and her lips from his lips, and with a light swish of her skirts had left the room, something warm remained behind, a breath upon Ajar's mouth, and a seductive longing came upon him to feel such soft lips upon his and to be so tenderly embraced often and often again. But this divination of the great secret, so longed for, was already clouded over by sleep. Once again all the happenings of the past hours flitted through Ajar's mind. Once again the leaves in the book of his childhood were turned alluringly. Then the child fell asleep, and the profounder dream of his life began.